They train me to clear structures. 22 years in frontier security forces, and that sentence covers more of my career than I'd like to admit. You go into a building. You confirm it's empty. You file a report. Somebody higher up the chain reads your report, decides the building can be demolished or decontaminated or repurposed, and signs off. You move on. The building becomes whatever it was always going to become, and you go clear the next one. It is exactly as glamorous as it sounds. My name is K.L. Matthijs, Sergeant, Frontier Security Forces, Clearance Verification Section, 3rd Frontier Division, 44 years old, 22 years in. I have cleared residential complexes, agricultural domes, transit stations, orbital transfer terminals, refugee processing centers, decommissioned mining platforms, and once a children's recreation facility on Vera 3 that turned out to still contain 6 functional automated custodial units that nobody had informed of the evacuation order. They kept trying to serve me nutritional supplements while I filed the paperwork. One of them followed me to the transport. I let it. I mention all of this because I want you to understand. I am not a dramatic man. I am not a man built for heroics or grand gestures or the kind of decisions that end up in tribunal transcripts. I am a man who walks into empty buildings and confirms that they are, in fact, empty. My entire professional identity rests on the word clear. Settlement Vethorin was supposed to be the same. Vethorin was a frontier colony on Orvath's northern plateau, 3rd-generation settlement, mixed population. Roughly 9,000 humans and 4,000 Thalari residents sharing a mineral extraction economy and a surprisingly competent public transit system. I'd been through Vethorin twice before on unrelated assignments. Decent place. The kind of settlement where the market served both human coffee and Thalari root brew, and nobody made a political statement about it. Then the substrate reaction happened. The technical explanation, which I sat through in a briefing room on Forward Base Aiken with 11 other sergeants and a lieutenant who kept checking her watch, was this. The mineral substrate beneath Vethorin's water processing facility contained a compound designation TK-4471 that had been stable for the settlement's entire 30-year operational history. Then it wasn't. A shift in the local water table, triggered by routine extraction operations, brought TK-4471 into contact with the processing system's filtration catalysts. The resulting reaction produced an atmospheric contaminant that was toxic to the Thalari respiratory systems at concentrations above 12 parts per million, and mildly irritating to humans at concentrations above 600. The settlement's ambient readings were climbing past 40. The Thalari were evacuated first. Corridor Transit Authority organized the movement. All 4,000 Thalari residents relocated to Transit Point Meridian 6, a processing station 47 hours out by standard corridor transport. The human population followed, moved to Forward Base Aiken and 2 secondary camps. All 9,000 humans confirmed. All 4,000 Thalari confirmed. Settlement designated for atmospheric remediation, the official term for what happens when you point an orbital bombardment array at a contaminated zone and burn the atmosphere clean. The settlement would survive the process, technically. The buildings would still be standing. Everything biological that wasn't sealed inside a hardened shelter would not. Which is where my section came in. The shelter network beneath Vethorin consisted of 7 sublevel structures, standard frontier colony design, built into the bedrock, intended to protect residents during atmospheric events, seismic activity, or the occasional territorial dispute with local fauna. Before atmospheric remediation could proceed, every shelter had to be verified empty. 7 shelters, 7 teams, 7 clearance reports. Mine was shelter Oran 3. I descended at 6:14 local time on a Tuesday. The access shaft was a cargo elevator that hadn't been maintained well enough to inspire confidence, dropping into a receiving bay 3 levels below the settlement's surface street. My atmospheric suit was sealed. My verification kit, scanner, manifest tablet, comm unit, and a handheld environment sensor that beeped if anything in the air wanted to kill me was secured to my chest harness. My sidearm was holstered and would stay there. You don't shoot things during clearance verification. You count things and confirm they aren't there. The receiving bay was empty. Emergency lighting cast the space in pale blue strips along the floor and ceiling. The air recyclers were still running. The shelter's independent power supply had another 40 hours, maybe 50. Evacuation notices were posted on every wall in colonial standard and the Lari script, the kind of pre-printed notices that transit authorities keep in storage for exactly these situations. The ink was still sharp, 3 days old. I started on level 1. Clearance verification is methodical. You work from a manifest, the settlement's shelter registry, which lists every compartment, storage bay, medical station, communal area, and utility room in the structure. Each one has a designation code. You walk to the designation, you open the door, you scan the interior, you confirm 0 biological presence, and you mark it on the manifest tablet. Then you move to the next one. Level 1 of Shelter Oran 3 had 46 designated spaces. Communal sleeping areas with folded cot frames stacked against the walls, a medical station with sealed supply cabinets and a single examination table, a food preparation area where someone had left a half-finished meal on the counter, a Valari grain bowl with a serving spoon still in it, the grain dried and cracked. They'd left in a hurry. I cleared level 1 in 53 minutes, 0 occupants. I noted the half-finished meal in my log because I note everything. It's not interesting, it's procedure. Level 2 took longer. The shelter's water reclamation system had developed a leak somewhere in the intervening days, and the eastern corridor was flooded to ankle depth. My boots handled it. The water was clear, filtered, not contaminated, but the footing was poor and 3 of the compartment doors had swollen in their frames and required manual force to open. Inside each one, empty. Cots, storage bins, personal effects left behind. A child's toy, a small fabric figure with button eyes, human-made, sitting on a pillow in one of the family compartments. Someone would miss that. I cleared level 2 in an hour and 11 minutes, 0 occupants. Level 3 was the lowest. The elevator didn't reach it. You took a stairwell from level 2, a narrow concrete passage that descended at a steeper angle than building codes would normally allow. Frontier construction. The emergency lighting on the stairwell had failed, and I used my helmet lamp to navigate the descent. The air was colder down here. The environment sensor registered TK4471 at 2 parts per million, seeping in through the bedrock. Harmless to me in the suit. Not harmless to the Lari at sustained exposure. Level 3 had 19 designated spaces. Smaller compartments, utility rooms, a secondary power control station, and a series of sealed storage bays along the far wall. The manifest listed all 19 as checked and cleared during the evacuation standard protocol. The evacuation team sweeps each level, confirms 0 occupants, seals the access points, and files a preliminary clearance. My job was the secondary verification, the double check. I started at the near end. Compartment 301, empty. A narrow sleeping compartment with 2 cots and a ventilation grate that rattled with each cycle of the failing air system. 302, empty. A utility closet with maintenance tools hung on wall pegs, wrenches, sealant applicators, a portable atmosphere tester still in its charging dock. Someone had been methodical about keeping this level stocked. The environmental systems were failing down here, the air recyclers cycling irregularly, the temperature dropping below comfort range, and then overcorrecting in sudden bursts of warmth that fogged my visor. My suit compensated. I wiped the visor and kept moving. 303 through 306. Empty, 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 empty. Each one told a small story in the things left behind. A pair of the Lari sandals placed neatly beside a cot, waiting for feet that had left without them. a water flask with condensation still beating on its ceramic surface. A child's drawing bright pigment on rough paper, showing two figures standing under a sky full of shapes that might have been stars or might have been something else entirely, pinned to the wall above a sleeping mat. Someone had lived here briefly, and then someone had told them to leave, and they had left the drawing behind because you don't carry everything when you're told to go. You carry what you can. I worked through compartments methodically, marking each one on the manifest tablet. 307, empty. 308, empty. A storage bay with sealed crates of emergency rations that nobody had needed, stacked floor to ceiling against the far wall. I checked the seals intact. The rations would survive the bombardment, sealed inside their hardened crates inside the hardened shelter. In 12 hours, this room would contain the only edible food in a 5-kilometer radius. Nobody would be here to eat it. 309 through 313, empty. The corridor narrowed as I moved deeper into level 3. The walls were rougher here, less finished concrete, more exposed bedrock, the kind of construction that happens when the budget runs out before the shelter does. The emergency lighting flickered. My environment sensor beeped. TK 4471 at 3 parts per million, then 4, seeping upward through the stone. Compartment 314 was listed on the manifest as checked, clear, 0 occupants. Verified by evacuation team leader Synth J. Timestamp, 3 days prior. The compartment seal was engaged from the inside. I stood in front of it for a few seconds. In 22 years of clearance work, I have encountered sealed compartments exactly 4 times. Twice it was a mechanical fault. The locking mechanism had engaged during the power transition when the shelter switched from primary to emergency supply. Once it was an automated custodial unit that had sealed itself inside a maintenance closet and refused to come out. Once, on Verith 7, 8 years ago, it was a man who had decided he wasn't leaving. He was alive. He was also intoxicated beyond the ability to operate a door seal, which is how he'd managed to lock himself in. I cleared him, filed the report, and the medical team handled the rest. I pressed the exterior override. The seal disengaged with a hiss of pressurized air. The compartment had been holding atmosphere independently. The door slid open. The compartment was small, 3 meters by 4, emergency lighting on the ceiling functioning, a single cot against the far wall, blanket folded. A water canister, the Lowry design, ceramic with a woven grip, sitting on the floor beside the cot, 3/4 empty. A foil wrapper from a ration bar, folded neatly and placed beside the canister. And sitting against the far wall, knees drawn up, watching me with pale green eyes that caught the light from my helmet lamp and held it. A child. The Lowry, small. Sandy gold skin with the faint ochre undertone that marks the Northern Plateau lineage groups. Dark copper hair, cut short and uneven, someone had trimmed it with a blade, not a proper tool. Delicate pointed ears, slightly too large for her head. She was wearing a tunic that was too big for her, adult-sized, the Lowry weave, faded to the color of old sand. Her feet were bare. Her hands were wrapped around a small object pressed against her chest. A carved stone, gray-green, worn smooth. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. She just watched me. I have been in rooms with armed combatants who unsettled me less than that child's silence. There was nothing in it that asked for help. There was nothing in it that expected help. She was just there, the way a stone is there, or a wall. She had settled into the fact of being alone the way you settle into weather. I checked the manifest. Compartment 314, checked, clear, 0 occupants. The manifest was wrong. I stepped inside, slowly. My suit would look like a monster to a child who'd been alone in a small room for 3 days, the helmet, the visor, the bulk of the atmospheric seal. I stopped 2 paces from her and crouched, brought myself closer to her height. The suit protested the angle. It wasn't designed for crouching. I didn't care. "Hey," I said, My voice came through the suit's external speaker, tinny and flat. "My name's Kale." She watched me, her fingers tightened on the stone. "Do you speak standard?" I asked. "Colonial standard, can you understand me?" A pause. Then, very quietly, in a voice that had the texture of something that hadn't been used in days. "Yes." One word barely audible. Her accent was the Lari, the vowels rounded, the consonant clipped. She understood. She just didn't have much to say. "What's your name?" I asked. Another pause, longer. "Eshka." "Eshka," I repeated. "I'm with Frontier Security. I'm here to make sure nobody's in the shelter." I stopped, realized how that sounded. "I mean, I'm here to help anyone who's still in the shelter." She looked at the door behind me, then back at me. "Are you alone down here?" I asked. She nodded, one small motion. "How long have you been here?" She didn't answer that. I think she'd stopped counting. I looked around the compartment. The water canister, 3/4 empty, which meant she'd started with a full one and had been drinking carefully. The ration wrapper. I looked more closely. 2 wrappers, actually, one folded neatly, one tucked beneath the cot. 2 ration bars over 3 days. She'd been rationing. A child, alone in a sealed room, rationing water and food. I've seen seasoned field operatives handle supply discipline worse than that. The compartment was clean. Not clean the way an empty room is clean, but clean the way a space is clean when someone has decided to maintain it. The blanket was folded. The water canister was upright and centered on the floor, not knocked over or shoved aside. The ration wrappers were folded, not crumpled. She had kept her space orderly because that was the one thing she could control when nothing else was in her hands. I noticed other details. Her fingernails were short, bitten, not trimmed. There were faint marks on the inside of her wrists where the tunic sleeves had been rolled and tied to keep them from dragging, a practical adjustment that someone her size would have needed to make the adult garment functional. Her bare feet were dusty from the concrete floor but not injured. She had stayed in this room, moving carefully, keeping things in order, drinking measured amounts, eating measured amounts, and waiting. For 3 days. The part of me that fills out reports and files clearance verifications, the administrative part, the procedural part, noted all of this with professional detachment. The other part, the part that has nothing to do with procedures, looked at a child who had been forgotten in a room that was scheduled to be burned from orbit, and felt something settle in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. "Okay, Eshka," I said. "We're going to go up now. I'm going to take you out of here. Is that all right?" She looked at me for a long time. Then she stood up. She was small, barely past my knee when I was crouching. The tunic hung to her ankles. She kept the stone pressed against her chest with both hands. "Up," she said, confirming, not asking. "Up," I said. I reached for my comm unit and opened the team channel. "Mathis to Darrow." Lieutenant Kira Darrow was the team lead for the Iran section, shelters 3 through 5. She was competent, organized, and approximately as interested in drama as I was. "Darrow, go ahead, Mathis." "I'm on level 3 of Iran 3. I have a biological contact, one the Lari child, sole occupant. She was in a sealed compartment listed as cleared on the evacuation manifest." Silence on the channel, 3 seconds, 5. "Say again, Mathis, you have a live contact." "Affirmative, one the Lari child, approximately." I stopped. "I don't guess ages, I don't give measurements. She was small. Young, she's been here since the evacuation. Compartment 314, manifest listed as clear." "Stand by." I stood by. Eshka stood beside me holding her stone. She hadn't moved toward me or away from me. She was just standing, waiting, the way she'd apparently been waiting for 3 days, patient beyond anything that should have been asked of her. The comm came back. Not Darrow. A voice I didn't recognize, older, clipped, with the cadence of someone reading from a decision tree. "Sergeant Mathis, This is Operations Coordinator Bren, Forward Base 8. Be advised, the Valari civilian evacuation from settlement Vethorin was completed and confirmed by Corridor Transit Authority on 6th day. All Valari residents accounted for. Population reconciliation verified at Transit Point Meridian 6. Your reported contact does not match any outstanding evacuation discrepancy. I waited for the part where they told me what to do about the child standing next to me. Your orders are to complete clearance verification of Shelter Aran 3 and file your report. If you have encountered a biological anomaly, log the coordinates and contact classification in your verification notes and withdraw to surface level for extraction. Remediation assessment teams will address post-clearance anomalies after atmospheric remediation is complete. I looked at Eshka. She was looking at my comm unit. She couldn't hear the other end, but she was watching it the way you watch a door that might open or might not. Operations, confirm. You're telling me to log the child's location and leave the shelter. Sergeant, your orders are to complete clearance verification and withdraw. Post-clearance anomalies will be addressed by remediation assessment. The atmospheric remediation is an orbital bombardment. Sergeant, atmospheric remediation protocols are not within the scope of clearance verification. Complete your assignment and withdraw. After the bombardment, there won't be anything to assess. Sergeant Mathis, the voice didn't change pitch or pace. Complete your verification, file your report, withdraw, operations out. The channel closed. I stood in a concrete room 3 levels below a settlement that was going to be burned from orbit in. I checked the timeline, 11 hours and 47 minutes. The air recyclers cycled. The emergency lighting hummed. Eshka held her stone. I opened my manifest tablet, Shelter Aran 3, Level 3. I scrolled through the compartments I'd already cleared, all marked. I reached compartment 314. I marked it clear, 0 occupants. Then I filed the verification report. Shelter Aran 3, all 3 levels verified, 0 biological contacts. Clearance confirmed. Signed, Mathis K. Sergeant FSFCVS. I closed the tablet. Eshka, I said, we're leaving now. She looked up at me, those pale green eyes, quiet, not trusting exactly, not yet, but open to the possibility. Can you walk? I asked. She nodded. Good, stay close to me. If I tell you to hold on, you hold on. If I tell you to close your eyes, you close your eyes. Understood? Yes. I took off my outer thermal liner, the insulated layer between the suit shell and the atmospheric seal. It left me with less protection against the cold, but I wasn't the one who'd been sitting in a concrete room for 3 days in a thin tunic. I wrapped it around her. It covered her from shoulders to the floor. She looked like a small, sandy gold face peering out of a silver cocoon. I pulled my auxiliary breather from the suit's emergency kit, a small face seal unit designed for short-duration atmospheric exposure, rated for human respiratory parameters but adjustable. I fitted it over her nose and mouth. The seal wasn't perfect against the Lari facial structure. The jorage interfered, but it was better than nothing. The TK-40-471 levels down here were still low, but they'd be higher on the surface, and I wasn't going to carry her through contaminated atmosphere without something over her face. This will feel strange, I said. Keep breathing normally. She breathed, the breather fogged and cleared. I picked her up. She weighed almost nothing. That's not a figure of speech. I have carried field packs that weighed more. She was light the way something is light when it hasn't had enough to eat for too long, and the difference between thin and small had gotten blurred somewhere in the past 3 days. She held the stone in one hand and gripped the shoulder strap of my suit harness with the other. Her grip was stronger than I expected. We started climbing. The stairwell from level 3 to level 2 was the worst part of the early ascent. No light, steep angle. I had one hand on the railing and one arm around Eshka, and my helmet lamp turned the stairwell into a narrow tunnel of white light and black shadow. She didn't make a sound. She pressed her face against my shoulder and kept her grip on the harness strap, and I could feel the carved stone against my collarbone through the suit. Level 2. The flooded corridor. The water had risen since I'd come through, ankle to mid-shin now and still climbing. A pipe had given way somewhere deeper in the system, and I could hear the metallic groan of water pressure building behind the walls. The emergency lighting reflected off the water's surface in long, wavering streaks that made the corridor look like it was moving. I waded through it. The suit handled the water. Eshka's bare feet, dangling below the thermal liner, dipped into it once when I shifted my grip, and she pulled them up without a word. I held her higher. "Sorry about that," I said. "The plumbing in this place is terrible. I'll be filing a complaint." She didn't laugh. I wasn't expecting her to, but I felt her grip shift, not relaxing exactly but adjusting, settling in. Like she'd decided that the voice she was hearing was the kind that kept talking, and she might as well get used to it. The water was deeper in the eastern corridor, shin to knee. I changed course, taking the western service passage instead, narrower but dry. The service passage ran behind the main compartments, a utility corridor lined with conduit bundles and access panels for the shelter's mechanical systems. The air recyclers were loud here, close to their housing units, cycling with an irregular rhythm that sounded like labored breathing. The temperature was dropping. The heating system on level 2 had failed entirely, and my breath fogged inside my helmet. I talked to Eshka as I walked. Not because she needed the information, but because silence in a failing shelter is the kind of silence that grows teeth. "Level 2 is clear," I told her, narrating. It was habit field operators narrate for their recorders. I turned my recorder off when I filed the false clearance report, but the habit stayed. "We're heading for the level 1 stairwell. After that, it's the elevator to the surface, assuming the elevator still works. If it doesn't, there's a maintenance ladder. I'll manage." She said nothing. "I've been doing this work for 22 years, I said. "Clearing buildings. You'd think after 22 years I'd have a better story about it, but the truth is most buildings are empty. That's the job. You confirm the obvious. It's deeply fulfilling work." I stepped over a pipe junction that was leaking a thin stream of water across the passage floor. The exciting part is when you find the automated custodial unit that won't leave. Those are the stories I tell at dinner. I felt her head turn, a small motion against my shoulder, like she was looking at me or trying to. "You're doing very well," I said, "for the record." The level 1 stairwell was intact but cold. The concrete walls were beaded with condensation that had frozen into a thin glaze of ice near the top. My boots found purchase. Eshka's weight shifted with each step, and I compensated, and we developed a rhythm the way you develop a rhythm with any carried load. Anticipate, adjust, keep moving. She was lighter than my field pack. She was steadier than my field pack. She held on with the focused attention of someone who has decided that holding on is the most important thing they can do right now and is giving it everything. I climbed it with my free hand on the railing and my breathing harder than I wanted it to be. 44 years old. Suit, harness, verification kit, sidearm, and a child. The child was the lightest part of the load. The suit was the heaviest. I made a mental note to file a weight reduction suggestion with Equipment Services, and then made a second mental note that Equipment Services would read it with the same enthusiasm. They'd read the last 47 weight reduction suggestions I'd filed. Level 1, the elevator. I pressed the call panel and waited. The elevator did not come. "Right," I said, "maintenance ladder." The maintenance ladder was a vertical shaft beside the elevator housing metal rungs set into a concrete wall, rising 12 meters to the surface receiving bay. Designed for one person. Designed for a person with 2 free hands. I looked at Eshka, she looked at me. "I need you to hold on," I said, "both arms around my neck. Can you do that?" She shifted. Her arms came up thin, stronger than they looked, and wrapped around my neck. The carved stone pressed against my throat. Her legs found the side of my harness and gripped. She was small enough that her weight settled against my back and chest without restricting my arm movement much. She'd done this before, I realized. Not climbing a ladder in a failing shelter with a soldier, but being carried, being held by someone larger who was moving through difficult ground. She knew how to distribute herself. I climbed. 12 meters, rung by rung, one hand and then the other. The rungs were cold through my suit gloves. Eshka didn't move. She breathed against my neck, steady and controlled, and I could hear the faint hiss of the auxiliary breather cycling. Halfway up, my right hand slipped on a rung that was slick with condensation, and my weight shifted, and for a half-second I was hanging by my left hand and my boot on a lower rung with a child on my chest and nothing below us but a 12-meter drop to concrete. My grip held. Eshka's arms tightened. I found the rung again and kept climbing. We reached the receiving bay. Surface level. The cargo elevator housing, the evacuation notices on the walls, the pale blue emergency lighting. I set Eshka down carefully, and she stood on her own feet and looked up at the access door that led to the surface. She knew where we were. She'd come through here during the evacuation, the one she'd somehow missed. I checked my comm. The team channel was quiet. Darrow hadn't followed up on my clearance report. She'd have seen it come through on the manifest system, seen it marked clear, and moved on to her next shelter. Nobody was asking where I was. Nobody was wondering why a clearance verification that should have taken 3 hours had taken 4.5. I checked the bombardment timeline. 9 hours and 13 minutes. The access door opened onto the settlement surface street. I pushed it open and the light hit us, hazy, brownish. The sky filtered through the atmospheric contamination that had turned Vethorin's air into something that tasted like rust even through a sealed suit. But it was daylight. After the shelter's emergency lighting, it was almost blinding. Eshka stood in the doorway and looked up at the sky. She hadn't seen it in 3 days. I gave her a moment. She deserved a moment. Then I picked her up again, and we started walking. The extraction perimeter was at forward checkpoint 8 and 7, a temporary staging area 2.3 kilometers north of the settlement core, established during the evacuation as the final surface departure point. The last transport was scheduled to withdraw 4 hours before the bombardment window opened. That gave me roughly 5 hours to cover 2.3 kilometers while carrying a child and wearing a full atmospheric suit in air that was slowly trying to poison anyone who breathed it. The math was manageable, the terrain was not. Vethorin's streets were empty. That particular kind of empty that a settlement achieves when everyone has left at once, not abandoned, not ruined, just absent. Doors sealed, windows shuttered, transit vehicles parked in their bays with their charging cables still connected. A cafe on the main avenue with chairs still arranged around the outdoor tables, as if the patrons had just stepped inside and would be back in a moment. A market stall with its awning still extended over bins of the Lari root vegetables that had begun to wilt in the contaminated air, their edges curling brown. A school, I recognized the play structures in the courtyard, the same modular design used in every frontier settlement, with its gates open and its windows dark. The evacuation had been orderly. People had locked their doors and taken their important things and walked to the transport stations and left. The settlement was waiting for them to come back. The settlement would still be here after the bombardment. The buildings were rated for atmospheric events. But everything that wasn't sealed, the air, the surfaces, the water, the soil and the planters along the main avenue, the cafe's outdoor chairs, the vegetables in the market stall would be scorched clean. And anyone who was still here when the bombardment hit would be scorched with it. Eshka's head turned as we passed the school. She looked at it for a long time, the play structures, the open gate, the dark windows. I don't know if it was her school. I don't know if she recognized it. She didn't say anything. But she looked, and I could feel something shift in the way she held on to me, a small tightening of her arms that might have been memory or might have been grief or might have been nothing at all. I walked. Eshka rode my hip, her arms around my neck, her face pressed against the collar of my suit where the seal met the helmet. The auxiliary breather covered her nose and mouth. I could feel her breathing steady, regular, controlled. She didn't ask where we were going. She didn't ask how far. She held on and I walked, and the settlement passed around us in a long, silent scroll of closed doors and sealed windows and the absence of everyone who should have been there. At the settlement's northern edge, the main avenue ended at an intersection with the mineral transport road, a wide, industrial surface designed for extraction haulers, running north toward the processing facilities and the plateau edge. The checkpoint was visible from here, 1.9 kilometers out, a cluster of temporary structures at the road's vanishing point. I could see the shuttle. I could see movement, ground crew probably, running the pre-departure checklist. The TK-4471 readings on my environment sensor were climbing, 14 parts per million at street level, 18, 22. The wind was pushing the contaminated air north, concentrating it along the road corridor. The threshold for the Lari respiratory distress was 12. The auxiliary breather was filtering most of it, but most is a word I didn't like in this context. I walked faster. There's a checkpoint, I told her. North side of the settlement, about 2 kilometers. There's a transport there. We get on the transport, we leave. That's the plan. She was quiet then. Why? I almost stopped walking. Not because the question was unexpected. It was the most reasonable question anyone had asked me all day. Why was I doing this? Why had I filed a false clearance report, picked up a child that my command had classified as a post-clearance anomaly, and started walking through contaminated atmosphere toward a checkpoint where I would have to explain why I was carrying a Lari child when my manifest said 0 occupants? Because you were there, I said, and leaving you there wasn't something I was going to do. She considered this. I felt her nod against my shoulder, one small motion. She accepted the answer the way she'd accepted the breather and the thermal liner, and the fact that a large man in a sealed suit had walked into her room and picked her up. Not with enthusiasm, with the quiet acknowledgement that this was what was happening, and she would see where it went. We passed the settlement's northern transit station, a passenger terminal with departure boards still showing routes, Corridor Meridian, Corridor Aiken, Local Circuit Vethorin/Industrial Zone. The displays flickered. The power grid was failing slowly the way things fail when nobody is maintaining them. I checked my comm again. No traffic on the team channel. My clearance report had been accepted. The system showed shelter around 3, verified clear. I was a liar. The system was satisfied with my lie. That is a particular kind of loneliness. When you tell a lie and nobody questions it because they have no reason to, and the weight of the lie is yours alone. The road north of the transit station left the settlement proper and crossed open ground mineral extraction territory, flat and rocky, with processing structures visible in the middle distance and the plateau edge a dark line against the hazy sky. The wind picked up. It carried dust and the faint chemical smell that even my suit's filters couldn't entirely suppress. Eshka's breather cycled faster. I checked the sensor. 31 parts per million. We're going to move quickly now, I said. Hold tight. I shifted her to my back, both arms around my neck, legs gripped around my waist, and I ran. Running in an atmospheric suit is exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. The suit fights you at every joint. The boots are designed for walking, not sprinting. The harness shifts, the verification kit bounces against your chest, and your breathing overwhelms the suit's air recycling capacity within the first 200 meters. But I ran because 31 parts per million was climbing toward 35, and because the auxiliary breather on Eshka's face was rated for 30, and because the checkpoint was 1.4 kilometers ahead and I could see it. A cluster of temporary structures and a landing pad and, thank God, the boxy silhouette of an FSF evacuation shuttle sitting on the pad with its running lights still active. I ran and I didn't stop. Eshka held on. The stone pressed into the back of my neck, hard-edged and smooth, and I focused on the feeling of it because it meant she was still there, still holding, still breathing. The mineral transport road was flat at least. Small mercies. But the surface was industrial, coarse aggregate designed for hauler treads, not for a man in sealed boots running at the upper limit of what his cardiovascular system would allow. My feet struck the ground and the ground pushed back, and each impact traveled up through my knees and hips and into my spine, and my spine had opinions about this arrangement that it communicated clearly and repeatedly. At a kilometer out I heard her cough, small, muffled by the breather, but I heard it. The TK-4471 was getting through. I ran harder. At 800 meters, my legs started to argue. At 600, they filed a formal protest. At 400, they attempted a work stoppage that I overruled through the simple mechanism of not giving them a choice. At 300, I could hear the shuttle's engine cycling, the pre-launch warm-up sequence, a sound that meant the pilot was getting ready to leave whether I was there or not. At 200 meters, I could see the checkpoint gate and the transport ramp, and a figure in FSF ground crew coveralls standing at the ramp's base, looking at a manifest tablet and not looking in my direction. At 100 meters, Eshka's arms tightened around my neck, not from fear, from something else. I think she could see the shuttle. I think she understood that the thing she'd been waiting 3 days for, someone coming, someone taking her somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't a sealed room in a condemned shelter, was right there in front of her. I reached the gate. I stopped running. My lungs were doing something I'd rather not describe. "Sergeant Mathies," I said to the ground crew figure between breaths. "Clearance verification, shelter Oran 3. He looked up from his tablet, looked at me, looked at the small figure wrapped in a silver thermal liner on my back, with a breather over her face and a carved stone clutched against my collar. "Sergeant," he said, "your manifest says 0 contacts." "My manifest is wrong," I said. He looked at Eshka, she looked at him. Her pale green eyes, over the edge of the breather, were steady. "I need a medic," I said. "She's been breathing TK-4471 at increasing concentrations for the last 40 minutes. The Lowry respiratory threshold is 12 parts per million. Get her inside." He didn't ask any more questions. He turned toward the shuttle and called for the medical team. They came. 2 medics, 1 human, 1 Verithi, with a portable atmospheric tent and a pediatric oxygen unit that wasn't designed for the Lowry physiology but could be adapted. I set Eshka down on the transport ramp. My arms didn't want to let go. That isn't a metaphor. My muscles had locked around her weight over 2.3 kilometers, and releasing the grip required a conscious, deliberate effort that I found more difficult than it should have been. The medic, the human one, a young woman with corporal's insignia and hands that moved fast and certain, knelt beside Eshka and started her assessment. Breather off. Atmospheric tent sealed around her. Oxygen flowing. Eshka sat inside the clear tent and watched the medic work with the same quiet patience she'd shown me in the shelter. She coughed twice, deeper coughs this time, wet, and the medic's expression tightened in a way that medics' expressions tighten when they're already planning the next 3 interventions. The Verithi medic, a tall, 4-armed figure with iridescent gray skin, and the precise movements of someone who has studied the Lowry respiratory physiology, adjusted the oxygen mixture. The Lowry lungs process gases differently than human lungs. The standard mix would help, but it wasn't optimal. The Verithi dialed in a custom blend from the shuttle's medical stores, working with a quiet competence that made me glad someone on this shuttle had studied more than one species' biology. I crouched beside the tent. My suit was overheated, my legs were finished, and my lungs were having a conversation with my ribs that I was not invited to. "Eshka," I said. She turned her head. Through the clear wall of the tent, I could see the color starting to come back to her face, the sandy gold warming as the clean oxygen reached her bloodstream. Her eyes were clear, tired but clear. "You're safe now," I said. "These people are going to take care of you. You're going to be all right." She looked at me through the atmospheric tent's clear wall. Then she held up the carved stone, pressed it against the tent wall on her side, so it was between us, her hand on one side, the wall between, my hand almost touching the other. I put my hand against the wall. The stone was smaller than my palm. I could see the texture of it through the clear material, gray-green, worn smooth by a hand that wasn't hers, a hand that had held it before she did. A parent's hand, maybe. A grandparent's. The kind of object that carries weight beyond its weight. "You hold on to that," I said. She nodded. The ground crew sergeant was behind me. "Sergeant Matthews, we need to lift in 12 minutes. Bombardment window opens in 4 hours and 41 minutes. We're final departure." "Copy," I said. I stood up. My legs expressed their opinion of this decision. I ignored them. I should have gotten on the transport. That was the correct action. That was what a reasonable man, a man trained in procedure, a man who had already filed one false report and committed one act of insubordination that would earn him a tribunal hearing, would do. Get on the transport. Leave the bombardment zone. Sort out the paperwork later. But my comm was open, and Operations Coordinator Bren's voice was on the command channel, and I was listening to him coordinate the final clearance confirmations for shelters Oran 1 through Oran 7, and I heard him read my report. Oran 3, verified clear, Sergeant Matthews. And I heard the bombardment authorization officer confirm that all 7 shelters were clear, and the remediation window could proceed as scheduled. My report, my lie. The authorization was going through because I'd said the shelter was empty, because the system had no reason to doubt me. It was empty. I'd made it empty. I'd taken the one thing that wasn't supposed to be there and carried her out. But the weight of it, the specific, technical weight of knowing that a bombardment authorization was proceeding on my false report, that if I'd been wrong, if there had been someone else down there, someone I'd missed, settled across my shoulders the way Eshka's weight had settled and didn't lift. "Sergeant, we need to board." I turned toward the transport ramp. Eshka was inside the shuttle now, the atmospheric tent secured to a medical cradle in the rear compartment. The medic was adjusting her oxygen flow. The shuttle's engines were cycling up, a deep thrumming vibration that I could feel through the landing pad's surface. I put my foot on the ramp. The first orbital strike hit the settlement core. 2.3 kilometers south. A column of white light, not fire, not an explosion, but light. A focused atmospheric ignition beam that turned the air itself into fuel and burned it clean. The sound reached us a second later, not a boom but a sustained roar, like the sky tearing. A continuous overwhelming pressure wave that shook the ground and the shuttle and every bone in my body. The ground crew sergeant grabbed my arm. "Go, go, go." The shuttle pilot didn't wait. Emergency protocol on first strike launch. The engines surged. The ramp began retracting. I was on the ramp, half on. 1 foot on the ramp, 1 foot on the pad. The shuttle was lifting. The second strike hit. Closer. The shockwave reached the checkpoint and the world turned sideways. I was thrown off the ramp, off the pad, into the open ground beyond the checkpoint perimeter. I hit the mineral substrate hard, shoulder first, and rolled, and the sky was full of light and sound, and the shuttle was climbing, ramp ceiling, navigation lights flaring against the burning haze. Eshka was inside. The third strike hit and I stopped counting because the ground was moving, and my suit's integrity alarm was screaming, and something in my left leg had made a sound that legs are not supposed to make. I covered my helmet with my arms and pressed myself flat against the ground and let the bombardment happen above me. It lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes of sustained orbital atmospheric ignition across the settlement zone. The heat reached me in waves, not direct. I was outside the kill radius, barely but radiant, pressing through my suit's thermal protection like sunlight through glass. The ground shook. Debris fell. Something heavy landed 3 meters to my left, and I didn't look at it. Then it stopped. The silence after an orbital bombardment is not actually silence. It's the absence of the specific, overwhelming noise that has replaced every other sound for the previous 7 minutes. What's left is the crackle of cooling surfaces, the hiss of atmosphere resettling, the tick of heated metal contracting. And in my case, the steady scream of my suit's integrity alarm and the somewhat less steady sound of my own breathing. I lay on the mineral substrate and stared at the hazy sky and waited. The recovery team found me 11 minutes later. 2 FSF ground personnel in heavy atmospheric suits, moving through the checkpoint perimeter with handheld scanners, looking for exactly what they found. 1 clearance verification sergeant, lying on his back outside the blast radius, with a compound fracture of the left tibia and fibula, a suit breach along the left leg seal, and a TK 4471 exposure reading that would keep the decontamination team busy for several hours. They carried me to a field medical unit, a temporary structure that had been set up behind the checkpoint perimeter for exactly this kind of contingency. The medic, a different one, male, older, with the tired efficiency of someone who has treated blast injuries before, cut my suit away from the left leg and made a sound that I chose to interpret as professional assessment rather than personal commentary. "The shuttle," I said, "the evacuation shuttle that launched from the pad, is it?" "Landed at forward base Aiken 22 minutes ago," he said. "All personnel and passengers accounted for." All passengers. That included a small Thalari child in an atmospheric tent. I closed my eyes. The field medic set my leg. The pain was significant and I was not graceful about it. Then they loaded me onto a medical transport and sent me to forward base Aiken's surgical ward, where a team I never properly thanked spent 4 hours reconstructing my left tibia from what one of them later described, in a moment of professional candor, as an ambitious puzzle. I woke up in a recovery ward, white ceiling, medical monitors, the specific institutional smell of a military hospital that is the same on every frontier base in every system I've ever served in. A window to my left showed the flat expanse of forward base Aiken's vehicle yard, baking in the kind of ordinary sunlight that seemed almost obscene after the hazy brown sky over Vethorin. My left leg was immobilized from hip to ankle in a reconstruction frame, a lattice of metal and biocomposite that held the bone fragments in alignment while the regenerative compound did its work. The doctors told me the regeneration would take 8 weeks. Full mobility would return in 12. Running was, they used the word, unlikely. Walking would be fine. Stairs would be fine. Running was unlikely. I had run 1.4 kilometers in an atmospheric suit carrying a child on my back. That was, apparently, the last time I would run anywhere. I asked about Eshka on the first day. The ward nurse checked the evacuation transport logs and told me the child was alive, stable, and had been transferred to the Thalari Community Medical Facility at Transit Point Meridian 6 for respiratory treatment. Stable, alive. I asked again on the second day and received the same information. On the third day, the nurse told me, not unkindly, that patient confidentiality applied to the Thalari minors the same as it applied to everyone else, and I should consider the fact that she was alive and stable to be sufficient good news. It was sufficient. I stopped asking. I lay in the recovery ward and looked at the ceiling and thought about clearance reports. I thought about compartment 314 and a manifest that said checked, clear, and a child sitting against the wall with her knees drawn up and a stone in her hands. I thought about the voice on the operations channel saying, log the coordinates and withdraw. I thought about what Remediation assessment teams will address post-clearance anomalies after atmospheric remediation is complete, actually meant when you strip the procedural language away. And what it meant was, we will deal with whatever is left after we burn it. And what would have been left of a small Valari child in a concrete room 3 levels below an orbital bombardment strike was nothing. Nothing at all. 3 days after surgery, Lieutenant Darrow visited. She brought a cup of coffee from the base canteen and set it on my bedside table and sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Your clearance report for shelter Orphan 3 has been flagged," she said. "I know." The evacuation shuttle that launched from checkpoint 8 and 7 carried a Valari child who was logged as recovered from the Orphan sector. Your manifest says 0 contacts. Those two facts don't reconcile. They don't. She waited. Darrow was good at waiting. "The shelter wasn't clear," I said. "There was a child in compartment 314. The evacuation team missed her. She wasn't on any manifest. Her family's registration had lapsed, or they were transient, or the system just missed her. She'd been alone for 3 days. I found her, I reported to operations, and operations told me to log her coordinates and withdraw. And you filed the clearance report instead." "I filed the clearance report. Then I carried her out." Darrow looked at her coffee. She hadn't touched it. She'd brought it for me, I realized. She wasn't drinking. "You filed a false verification report that authorized an orbital bombardment," she said. "That's a Section 11 offense." "I know what it is." "If there had been anyone else in that shelter." "There wasn't." "If there had been." I looked at her. "There wasn't. I cleared every compartment, 19 spaces on level 3, 46 on level 1, 31 on level 2 with water up to my shins. The shelter was clear. I made it clear. I took the only person in it and I carried her out. And I filed the report because if I'd reported a live contact, operations would have logged her as a post-clearance anomaly, and remediation assessment teams don't arrive until after the bombardment. She would have died." Darrow was quiet for a long time. "The investigation is being handled by Division Command," she said. "Colonel Vent." She left the coffee and went. Colonel Ashara Vent arrived 4 days later. She was a tall woman in her 50s with cropped gray hair and a command presence that could have cleared a shelter by itself. She stood at the foot of my bed and reviewed my medical chart with the dispassionate attention of someone who reads charts regularly and finds them consistently inadequate. "Sergeant Matthijs," she said, "your reconstruction is proceeding well." "Yes, ma'am." "Your physical therapy begins next week. The prognosis is full ambulatory recovery with the exception of high-impact activities. You'll walk, you won't run." "So they tell me." She put the chart down, pulled the chair to the bedside, sat. "The child," she said. "Eshka, no family name on record. The Corridor Transit Authority has located her in their system. She was the dependent of a single-parent family unit, the Lari National, who died of respiratory complications from TK-4471 exposure 6 days before the general evacuation was ordered. The child's registration lapsed with the parent's death. She wasn't captured by the evacuation manifest because she wasn't in the system anymore. She was in the shelter because a neighbor brought her there during the initial atmospheric alert, and then left during the formal evacuation without confirming she'd been included. A neighbor brought her and then left. I thought about that. I thought about a child sitting in a compartment, watching the door close, waiting for someone to come back. 3 days. She is currently at Transit Point Meridian 6, Colonel Vent continued. The Valari Community Council has placed her with a kinship care family, an elder from the Northern Plateau lineage who volunteered when the Transit Authority identified her. She's being looked after. Good, I said. It was all I could say and mean it. Your clearance report, the colonel said. I waited. Shelter Orphan 3, verified clear. 0 biological contacts. She recited it from memory. She didn't need my file. Filed at 8:47 local time. The bombardment authorization was processed based on your report and the 6 others. Atmospheric remediation proceeded at 11:19. Yes, ma'am. You filed a false verification report, Sergeant. Yes, ma'am. A false report that authorized the destruction of a populated area. An unpopulated area, I said. I made it unpopulated. The shelter was clear when the bombardment hit. She looked at me. There was something in her expression that I'd seen exactly once before on the face of my father, 30 years ago, when I'd done something that was technically wrong and practically right, and he'd had to decide which one mattered more. The shelter was clear when the bombardment hit, Colonel Vent repeated. She said it slowly. Your report is accurate as of the moment of remediation. I didn't say anything. Your report will stand, Sergeant. The investigation is closed. The verification of shelter Iran 3 is confirmed. Clear at time of atmospheric remediation, 0 occupants. She stood up. Your field career in clearance verification is over, she said. Your mobility limitation disqualifies you from active ground assignment. Personnel services will discuss reassignment options when you're ambulatory. Yes, ma'am. She walked to the door, stopped. Matthijs. Ma'am. The child was not a post-clearance anomaly. She was a person. Your report reflected that, even if it didn't say so. She paused. I would have done the same thing, but I'm not required to tell you that. She left. The reconstruction took 9 weeks, not 8. The physical therapy took 14 weeks after that. I walked the corridors of forward base Aiken's medical wing with a support frame and then a cane and then nothing, and my left leg worked the way it had always worked except for the part where it didn't, which was the part involving speed. I walked. I climbed stairs. I did not run. Personnel services offered me a desk assignment, clearance documentation review, 3rd Frontier Division. I would review other sergeants' clearance reports from an office on the base. I would read their manifests and confirm their numbers and flag discrepancies for investigation. I would sit at a desk and do the administrative version of what I'd done in the field for 22 years. I accepted. I didn't have a better idea. 7 months after the bombardment, a package arrived at the base mail office addressed to Sergeant Cale Matthijs. No return name. The origin routing showed Corridor Transit Point Meridian 6, the Lari Community Sector. Inside the package, wrapped in a piece of woven the Lari cloth the color of old sand, was a carved stone. It was smaller than the one Eshka had carried in the shelter. Gray-green, worn smooth, shaped by hand. On one side, a pattern had been incised into the surface, a series of interlocking lines that I didn't recognize as script or symbol. I turned it over. On the other side, a single mark, a small handprint pressed into the stone before it had hardened, a child's hand. There was no note. There didn't need to be. I sat at my desk in the clearance documentation review office, in my chair that was comfortable enough and my uniform that still fit, and I held the stone in my palm and I felt the weight of it. It was lighter than the one she'd carried. It was heavier than anything I'd ever held. I reported the shelter clear. It was the truest lie I ever told.